I witnessed my husband's affair. I believe such experiences are rare. Most people confront their husbands after finding evidence of infidelity on their phones, but I happened to see it with my own eyes. Never did I imagine that it would be in such a place, witnessed by so many people. Sure, I had felt suspicious about the relationship for a while, but I never expected to see my husband doing that in such a place. I'm Sophia, a full-time housewife with a 6-year-old son. On the day I witnessed the affair, my husband was off at work and we planned to go out as a family, but when I woke up, my husband was already gone. There was a message on my phone from my husband saying, "My sister has a high fever of 39 degrees, so I'm going to take care of her. It seems that no one is at home today. I'll be back in the evening." I let out a big sigh. I had told our son that we were going to the amusement park today, and he had been looking forward to it for days now. I was told that my husband was recently put in charge of a major project, and he hadn't been able to take a break for the past 6 months. So this break was a rare chance for some family time, but he ended up taking care of his sick sister. His sister is supposed to be engaged, so it should be fine to leave it to him. Anyway, my husband has a sister complex. The reason why I started dating him was because he said, "You're wonderful because you're like my sister," which made me feel a little uneasy. Well, his sister is very beautiful and kind when I met her, so I guess that resembling her is the highest compliment from my husband, but I couldn't help but feel creeped out. My husband used to say, "I want a boy and a girl," and frequently tried to make that happen. But since our son was born, his tendencies have significantly decreased. Now it's almost non-existent. We're still young, and my husband used to enjoy our private time, so I can't help but suspect that he's doing it with another woman and cheating. Well, if he just betrays me, I could still forgive him. It's infuriating though, but the problem is that he disappears from morning even on his days off, like today. On his days off, he could at least play with the kid once in a while, couldn't he? Our child is such a daddy's boy, and he cries when he realizes his father is not around. My husband is too indifferent towards our child. He doesn't even prepare a birthday present or participate in school events no matter how free he is. Even when he comes home early, occasionally, he retreats to his room and plays video games. He hardly ever faces our son. Our son, who used to be a daddy's boy, will probably start to see his father as a stranger if this continues. Oh, and the part about my husband being busy because he was promoted to project manager was all a lie. I mean, he hardly ever comes home. So once I asked a former classmate who works at the same company as my husband, "Is my husband really that busy?" My classmate laughed and told me, "No way. Your husband is actually a window side employee, and he always looks free because he has no work. He leaves work on time every day." I thought, I knew it. And after all, despite supposedly being put in charge of a major project, his salary is only around 200,000 yen, and he's never exhausted from working overtime. In fact, he looked rather glossy. This is also a factor that made me suspect his infidelity. Despite harboring a lot of dissatisfaction, I finished preparing breakfast. I checked the time and tilted my head. This is strange. Usually he wakes up by 7 o'clock, even if I don't wake him, but it's already past that time. At this rate, he will miss the bus to the nursery, so I hurriedly went to wake up my son. In the room, my son was still sleeping, and when I tried to wake him up saying, "It's morning, wake up!" instead of a response, I heard a groan of pain. As I worried, I reached out to my son's painful face and put my hand on his forehead. It was very hot. I called my son's name and lightly shook his shoulder. Barely opening his eyes, my mom said, "Mom, it hurts." I panicked for a moment. Around that time, there was an outbreak of an illness at the daycare center, and I wondered if my son had caught it too. I had heard that there were cases of people that died from it, so I seriously thought my son might not make it. In desperation, I called my husband, but he didn't answer. With no time to wait for a reply to an email, I decided to call my mother and ask for first aid advice. My mother is a nurse, so I thought it would be best to ask her. Under my mother's precise instructions, I quickly prepared a cold compress and measured my son's temperature. It's over 39 degrees Celsius. I called an ambulance and made sure my son drank a lot of fluids while waiting for it to arrive. According to my mother, there was also a possibility of heat stroke. considering the risk of infection, I wasn't allowed to accompany him in the ambulance, so I called a taxi and headed to the hospital where he would be taken. In the meantime, I kept calling my husband, even though I knew it was futile. As expected, it was pointless. With no other choice, I left a message. I figured he was come as soon as he noticed, assuming he would still be responsible enough to do so. I arrived at the hospital and prayed as I waited in the corridor outside the emergency room for my son to make it through. My father had once been taken into the emergency room just like this, and he never came out. Just as I was imagining the worst, thinking, what if my son doesn't come out either? My mother, who had just rushed to us, said, "It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay." And then an hour later, my son miraculously survived. We were told that he should be hospitalized for at least a week, so he was taken straight to another ward. In the end, my husband didn't come home that day. The next day, I went home to get my son a change of clothes, and I decided to visit him in the hospital with some fruit and books to read. I also planned to say hello to the doctor who had taken care of us the day before, so I passed by the emergency room. Suddenly, the area became hectic. I thought, maybe someone was brought in. So I decided to postpone saying hello to the doctor so I wasn't in the way. Just as I was about to go to my son's ward, I saw a man and a woman being carried in on a stretcher. They were barely covered with a thin blanket, almost as if they were naked. It seems like they were still joined together. How does that even happen? I've never experienced it, but it must be quite troublesome. Being carried in this state, extremely embarrassing. As I was thinking this and about to pass by, I made eye contact with the man. Under normal circumstances, it would be an awkward situation, but for me, it was different. Because the man was my husband. Why are you here like this? I exclaimed in surprise.
No, well, I caught my sister's cold, and so,
My husband was lost for words. At that moment, I was also confused. My son had just been taken here yesterday, and now my husband too? What are the odds of that happening? And why was my husband being carried in naked? And who was the woman with him? All sorts of thoughts were whirling around in my head. In the midst of all this, I accidentally made contact with the woman who was intertwined with my husband. Even in my state of confusion, I can tell. This woman is my husband's mistress. As I glared at her, I realized that her face looked very familiar. Why, Sophia, here! Hearing her voice, I finally remembered. Yes, that woman was Amelia, my husband's sister. I felt this moment was incredibly long. I suspected my husband was lying about taking care of his sister and meeting a woman instead. But I never expected this. Even if he was coming to visit our son, he should not have come while still joined with a woman. But the woman is his actual sister? There are no limits to how much one can mess around. Because they were in the emergency room, all I could do was hold back my urge to lunge at them and wait. They couldn't escape anyways, so I decided to confront them at a later date. With that thought in mind, I headed to visit my son, still feeling deeply sickened. I spent some time in my son's room, trying to sort out my feelings. When I casually checked my phone, I saw a ton of messages from my husband. Looking at the content, it was all just him trying to cover up his actions. He didn't even mention our son's hospitalization. I decided to keep ignoring him and waited another hour. When the doctor who had been in charge of my son the day before appeared, the doctor smiled to me and said,
"Your son is doing very well. He might be able to get discharged earlier than expected."
His fever had come down and his condition seemed to have completely stabilized. Initially, I was worried about an infectious disease, but it seems he had heat stroke in addition to a cold.
You made sure he drank a lot of water, didn't you? That was the right move. You're a smart mother, and you did well to help him.
He praised me for my efforts. If anything, it's thanks to my mother. I'll have to buy her a gift. I deeply bowed to the kind doctor and expressed my gratitude, but it wasn't hard to imagine that I was about to face quite a storm. I had just been relieved about my son's condition, but I was beginning to boil inside. Mommy's face is scary. I had frightened my son. I quickly put on a smile and told my son, "I'll be right back," before stepping outside the hospital and calling my husband, who had left more than 100 unanswered calls. The moment my husband answered the phone, he started.
"It's not what you think. There's a reason.
And he started making excuses. He's got it all wrong. What about our dear son? Well, there's no way a man who is so engrossed in this act with his own sister, completely disregarding our son, would worry about him. With a husband like this, I worry about my son's future. As I didn't think my husband's nature would improve, I decided to divorce him. I think life will be tough, but for my son's sake, I can endure it, right? I told him.
You were busy with that even when our son was suffering, right? You've always been doing that whenever you had time, hadn't you? And with your own sister. It's really disgusting.
My husband was at a loss for words. I continue.
Oh, and by the way, I've already reported this to your parents. I won't tell your company. It would be a problem if you can't pay alimony and child support. So goodbye,
I said to my husband, expressing my finality. 3 days later, my son's health recovered well, so after completing the discharge procedures, we returned home together for the first time in a long time. Of course, my husband wasn't there. After the commotion, my husband showed up to apologize directly, but I shoved the divorce papers, already signed, in his face. My husband begged,
It was my first time. Forgive me for one mistake. You're all I have.
but I coldly told him,
So you're still lying at this point? I already know everything. Your sister confessed to me.
yes, I anticipated that my husband wouldn't easily agree to a divorce, so to silence him, I first approached his sister, the other person at fault.
Sister-in-law, I heard that you're going to have a wedding ceremony with your boyfriend soon. Congratulations! I was thinking of sending a congratulatory message, and a good idea came to mind. Want to know what it is? No way! You're not planning to talk about this, are you? Yes, because I want everyone to know. Once I expose you, they'll understand what kind of person you really are.
I smiled slyly.
Please, anything okay, but not that. If you do that, my life will be over.
I pretended to think for a moment and then continued with a smile.
That can't be helped. Then let's do this. I'll keep quiet about this matter if you tell me in detail exactly what happened with my husband, your brother. Then, if you tell me the truth, I will keep quiet. Of course, your younger brother will feel betrayed, but what will you do?
Then, without hesitation, my sister-in-law confessed everything, begging, I'll tell you everything, just please don't tell him. When I told my husband this, he fainted from the shock of being betrayed by the sister he loved more than anyone else. After waking up, my husband signed the divorce papers and left the house dejectedly. From then on, through my lawyer, I demanded custody of our son, alimony, and child support from him. He haggled over the amount, but when I whispered in his ear, "Would you like me to spill the beans to your company?" he said,
All right, I'll pay the amount you said.
and left the lawyer's office. Somehow the company found out about what happened, and my husband was summoned and severely reprimanded. A month later, he was fired from the company, and now he works in a food factory putting strawberries on cakes and paying alimony and child support. Somehow the factory also knows about what he did, and he seems to be constantly gossiped about, making him uncomfortable. As for my husband's sister, despite the fact that I didn't expose her, everything came out anyway. She was dumped by her fiancé. It seems that the boyfriend, like me, suspected infidelity and had hired a private investigator to conduct surveillance. She was instructed to pay a large sum of money as compensation for breaking off the engagement, and now she's working at a nightclub. Also, the other day, I was given an explicit photo of them by her ex-boyfriend saying,
Use it if something happens.
I wondered what kind of nerve he had to give me such a horrible photo, but I decided to keep it in my dresser. I'll gratefully use it as a precaution in case I get a message from my ex-husband or something happens. I moved back to my parents' home to start fresh, and I'm working hard to raise my son with their help. Since my parents live far away, they have been longing to see their grandson and told me they would help as much as they could. I don't want to overburden them, but I guess I'll only ask for help when I need it. Now, my son has overcome his high fever. That was a stressful time, but he has been healthy ever since. And now, 3 years later, he is always recognized for perfect attendance. He seems to have completely forgotten about his real father and is enjoying his life. This is what makes me happiest. Oh, by the way, I have a new family member. It's a white cat named Snow, who is comfortably sleeping on my lap. It was when I said my final goodbye to Snow, who often came to play in my yard before I moved. Just as usual, she'd climb onto my lap and wouldn't budge. I was also sad to leave Snow behind, so I decided to bring her home with me. Now, Snow is a good friend to my parents and my family home, and is just as important to me as my son.